The morning fog clung to the hedgerows like wet wool. January 12, 1945. Somewhere east of Bastogne, Belgium. The snow had turned to slush under the treads of retreating armies, and the roads were rivers of frozen mud. A German recovery crew, 3 men in a battered SD-9 half-track, rolled cautiously through the shattered remnants of a village whose name no longer mattered. Their mission was simple: salvage anything the Americans left behind. Fuel, ammunition, vehicles, anything that could be repaired, repurposed, or stripped for parts. The Reich was bleeding steel, and every abandoned tank was a gift from God or desperation. Then they saw it. A Sherman M4A3, olive drab and silent, nose down in a drainage ditch at the edge of a frozen field. No smoke. No fire. Just sitting there like a wounded animal waiting to be claimed. The driver of the half-track, a man named Feldwebel Ernst Kohler, squinted through the frost-cracked windshield. His breath fogged the glass. He wiped it with a gloved hand and muttered something his companions didn't hear. The turret hatch was open. The barrel pointed uselessly at the sky. No crew in sight. No bodies. Just an empty tank stuck in the mud, waiting. By January 1945, the Western Front had become a graveyard of metal and men. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied lines, had stalled in the forests of the Ardennes. The German offensive, launched on December 16, 1944, had driven deep into American positions, creating chaos and panic. But the weather cleared. Allied air power returned. And the German advance, starved of fuel and reinforcements, began to collapse. The roads were littered with the wreckage of that collapse. Burned-out Panthers. Overturned trucks. Abandoned half-tracks with their engines seized from cold. The Americans, pushing back with overwhelming force, left their own scars. Sherman tanks, the backbone of U.S. armored divisions, dotted the landscape wherever the fighting had been fiercest. Some were destroyed by German fire. Others broke down. Many simply got stuck. The Sherman M4A3 by early 1945 was a proven but imperfect machine. It was reliable, easy to produce, and available in staggering numbers. Over 50,000 would be built by war's end. But it had weaknesses. Its narrow tracks, designed for industrial efficiency, gave it poor weight distribution. In mud, snow, or soft ground, a Sherman could sink like a stone. Its 30-ton weight, concentrated on relatively small contact patches, made it vulnerable to terrain that German tanks, with wider tracks and better ground pressure, could traverse more easily. American armored doctrine prioritized speed and numbers over individual tank superiority. Sherman crews were trained to operate in groups, overwhelming German armor through flanking and volume of fire. But when a Sherman fell behind, engine trouble, thrown track, mechanical failure, it became a liability. Sometimes the crew abandoned it. Sometimes they stayed, waiting for recovery vehicles that might never come. And sometimes they set traps. The U.S. Army's Ordnance Corps operated dedicated tank recovery units equipped with M32 tank recovery vehicles, Shermans modified with winches, cranes, and towing equipment. But in the chaos of the Bulge, these units were stretched thin. Tanks were often left where they fell, marked for later retrieval. Maps were made. Coordinates logged. But in contested territory, those maps meant nothing. A tank abandoned at dawn could be in enemy hands by noon. The Germans knew this. Their own recovery doctrine, refined over years of retreat, emphasized speed and opportunism. The SD-9 FAMA half-track was the workhorse of German recovery operations. An 18-ton vehicle with a 12-ton winch, it could tow most armored vehicles short distances, or drag them out of mud and ditches. Recovery crews operated in the gray zones, the no-man's lands between front lines, scavenging, salvaging, and often risking their lives for a few extra hours of operational life for a Panzer or Stu-G. But by January 1945, those crews were also desperate. The German armored force was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages meant tanks sat idle even when operational. Spare parts were scarce. New production was strangled by Allied bombing. Every captured or salvaged vehicle, even an enemy one, was valuable. Shermans in particular were prized. Their engines could be cannibalized. Their radios, optics, and machine guns stripped. In rare cases, captured Shermans were repainted and pressed into German service, usually for rear area security or propaganda purposes. So when Feldwebel Kohler and his crew spotted that lone Sherman, stuck and silent in the frozen mud, they saw opportunity. They saw survival. They saw a chance to prove their worth to officers who had long since stopped caring about individual lives and started counting only vehicles, fuel, and time. They did not see the trap. War is waste. But in the winter of 1945, waste had become currency. Every shell casing, every discarded rifle, every broken-down vehicle represented something that could no longer be easily replaced. The industrial might of the United States was flooding Europe with material, tanks, trucks, ammunition, food, in quantities the German war machine could no longer match. But even American abundance had limits. Tanks were expensive. Crews were irreplaceable. And recovery operations in contested or hostile territory were dangerous. American commanders understood this. So did their soldiers. And so, by late 1944, a grim kind of tactical deception had emerged on both sides: the bait tank. The concept was simple. A disabled or abandoned tank, particularly one that appeared intact, could be left in a visible position deliberately to lure enemy recovery crews or curious infantry. Hidden nearby, a squad of infantry, a concealed tank destroyer, or another Sherman would wait. When the enemy approached, the ambush would spring. It was psychological warfare layered with tactical violence. It exploited greed, necessity, and the fog of war. The tactic wasn't formalized. It wasn't written into field manuals or taught at armor school. But it spread through the ranks like folklore, passed from unit to unit, whispered in foxholes and around campfires. Some crews volunteered to stay with their disabled tanks, becoming bait themselves. Others set traps with radio-detonated explosives or booby-trapped hatches. The goal was always the same: deny the enemy resources, inflict casualties, and create an atmosphere of paranoia. German recovery crews learned to be cautious. They would observe a potential salvage target for hours, watching for movement, scanning for tracks in the snow, listening for engine noise or radio chatter. They traveled in pairs when possible, one vehicle to tow, another to provide covering fire. They carried small arms, grenades, and sometimes a Panzerfaust or two. They knew the Americans were clever. They knew the risks. But desperation is a powerful motivator. The Sherman M4A3 that Kohler and his crew found that morning fit every profile of a legitimate abandonment. It was nose down in a ditch, a common result of drivers losing traction on icy slopes. The turret hatch was open, suggesting the crew had bailed out in a hurry. There were no visible battle damage, no penetration holes, no scorch marks from fire. The tracks appeared intact. The engine, if still functional, could be worth its weight in gold. Or at least in diesel fuel and spare parts. Kohler dismounted from the declassified and approached on foot, rifle slung across his chest. His two crewmen, Gefreiter Hans Lessing and Oberstfreiter Otto Brandt, stayed with the half-track, engine idling, ready to move. The field was silent except for the whisper of wind through bare trees. No birds. No distant artillery. Just cold and stillness, and the faint creak of frozen metal. Kohler circled the Sherman slowly. He checked the ground for fresh tracks. Nothing. He looked for tripwires near the hatches. Nothing. He climbed onto the rear deck and peered into the open turret. Empty. The crew had taken their personal items. The radio was still in place, though possibly damaged. The main gun breech was closed. The ammunition racks were full. He felt a flicker of doubt. Why would they leave ammunition? But doubt was a luxury. He waved to his crew. Lessing brought the half-track forward, positioning it behind the Sherman. Brandt unwound the heavy tow cable, a thick steel rope coated in grease and rust. They worked quickly, hooking the cable to the Sherman's rear tow shackle, a reinforced loop designed exactly for this purpose. The connection was solid. Kohler climbed back into the cab of the declassified, gripped the controls and began to ease the half-track forward, taking up slack. The cable went taut. The Sherman groaned. Metal scraped against frozen earth. The half-track's engine roared, tracks biting into the mud. Slowly, centimeter by centimeter, the Sherman began to shift. And then, from the tree line 200 meters away, a turret traversed. Feldwebel Ernst Kohler was 32 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front, a survivor of Kursk and the retreat from Ukraine. He had seen cities burn and armies dissolve. He had watched friends die in ways that defied language. By the time he was reassigned to recovery operations in the West, he no longer believed Germany could win. But belief was irrelevant. Survival was all that remained. Recovery work was exhausting, dangerous, and thankless. Officers treated recovery crews as scavengers, necessary but beneath notice. The men themselves were often older, wounded, or deemed unfit for frontline combat. Kohler had a shrapnel scar across his left shoulder that limited his mobility. Lessing had lost 2 fingers to frostbite in Russia. Brandt was 51 years old, a former factory foreman conscripted in 1943. They were not elite soldiers. They were not heroes. They were simply trying to live one more day. When they found the Sherman, Kohler felt a brief, irrational surge of hope. A successful recovery might earn them a commendation, or at least a night's rest in a warm barn instead of a frozen foxhole. It might prove they still had value. That they still mattered. The Reich was collapsing, but small victories could still mean something. That hope died the moment he saw the muzzle flash. The M4A3 Sherman was never meant to be a dueling tank. It was not designed to go head-to-head with German Panthers or Tigers. Its 75mm gun, later upgraded to a 76mm on some models, could penetrate most German armor at close range, but it was outclassed by the high-velocity cannons of late-war German tanks. Its armor, 50mm on the front hull and turret, could be defeated by nearly every German anti-tank weapon in service. But the Sherman had one advantage: there were thousands of them. American doctrine accepted losses. Shermans were built to be replaced. Crews were trained quickly, deployed rapidly, and expected to learn on the battlefield. The tank's mechanical reliability meant it could be repaired in the field more easily than German tanks, which were engineering marvels prone to breakdowns. A Sherman might not survive a direct hit from a Panther, but 5 Shermans working together could overwhelm and flank that Panther before it reloaded. This philosophy extended to abandonment and recovery. A Sherman stuck in mud was not a tragedy, it was a tactical problem with an acceptable solution. Leave it, mark it, recover it later if possible. If not, destroy it or let the enemy waste resources trying to take it. And if the enemy did try, punish them for it. The Sherman in the ditch was a casualty of terrain, not combat. Its crew had been ordered to advance through a narrow farm road the day before, hit a soft patch of ground hidden under snow, and sunk to the belly pan. The driver had tried to rocket free. The crew radioed for help. But the front was moving too fast. They were told to abandon the vehicle and rejoin their unit on foot. The platoon leader, a lieutenant named Harris, made a decision: leave it as bait. From a tactical standpoint, using a disabled tank as bait was a calculated risk. It required manpower, at least a squad of infantry or a single armored vehicle to act as the hidden element. It required patience, hours or even days of waiting in freezing conditions. And it required the enemy to take the bait, which was never guaranteed. But the rewards could be significant. Destroying or capturing a German recovery vehicle removed a critical asset from enemy logistics. Killing or capturing the crew eliminated experienced personnel who were increasingly irreplaceable. And psychologically, it reinforced the idea that nothing on the battlefield was safe. Every opportunity could be a trap. Every decision carried mortal risk. Lieutenant Harris positioned an M10 tank destroyer, a lightly armored but powerfully armed vehicle, in a concealed position among the trees overlooking the field. The M10 carried a 3-inch gun, capable of penetrating nearly any German armor at medium range. Its crew, 4 men commanded by Sergeant Roy Kemp, had orders to wait, watch, and fire only when the enemy committed fully. Kemp was 24 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who had learned patience hunting deer in November snow. He understood the psychology of the trap. The Germans would scout. They would hesitate. But eventually need would outweigh caution. And when the tow cable went taut, when they were focused on the task, when their backs were turned and their escape routes limited, that was when you struck. American military strategy in Europe was built on a simple, brutal truth. The United States could produce war material faster than Germany could destroy it. By 1945, American factories were churning out a Sherman tank every hour. Trucks, artillery, ammunition, and aircraft flowed across the Atlantic in convoys that German U-boats could no longer interdict effectively. The economic war was over. America had won. This abundance shaped tactical thinking. Commanders could afford to be aggressive because losses could be replaced. Soldiers could afford to take risks because reinforcements were always coming. And vehicles could be used as tools, not treasures. A Sherman was not irreplaceable. It was a temporary asset, valuable only as long as it contributed to the mission. This mindset extended to deception operations. If a disabled tank could delay, distract, or destroy enemy forces, it was worth leaving behind. The cost of one Sherman, roughly $44,000 in 1945 dollars, was negligible compared to the cost of losing momentum, allowing the enemy to regroup or failing to exploit a breakthrough. German soldiers, by contrast, operated in a culture of scarcity. Every vehicle mattered. Every gallon of fuel was precious. Recovery crews took risks that American crews would have considered suicidal, because the alternative was watching their army starve for lack of mobility. Fear is a force multiplier. An ambush doesn't just destroy the enemy, it changes how they think. After a few encounters with bait tanks, German recovery crews would hesitate before approaching any abandoned vehicle. They would waste time on reconnaissance. They would second-guess their instincts. They would move slower, more cautiously, reducing their operational efficiency even when no trap existed. This was the hidden value of the tactic. Even unsuccessful ambushes, traps that were never sprung because the enemy didn't take the bait, still had an effect. They created an atmosphere of paranoia. They forced the enemy to expend mental and emotional energy on constant vigilance. They eroded trust in the battlefield environment. Sergeant Kemp understood this instinctively. He had been part of ambush operations before, near Metz and again during the Bulge. He had seen German infantry freeze, unwilling to cross open ground even when no enemy was visible. He had seen recovery crews abandon vehicles halfway through salvage operations, spooked by a distant sound or a shadow in the trees. Fear, once planted, was self-sustaining. The term hidden escort, in the context of WWII armored operations, referred to any concealed element, infantry, armor, artillery, or air support, positioned to protect or avenge a vulnerable asset. It could be as simple as a bazooka team in a hedgerow or as complex as a coordinated fire mission from multiple positions. In this case, the escort was Sergeant Kemp's M10 tank destroyer and its four-man crew. The M10 was ideal for ambush work. It was fast, mobile, and mounted a powerful gun. But it was also lightly armored, vulnerable to direct fire. Its open-top turret made it susceptible to artillery and grenades. It was a weapon of stealth and surprise, not stand-up fights. Kemp's crew had been in position since the previous evening. They had camouflaged the M10 with branches and snow-covered tarps. They had cleared fields of fire, marking ranges with makeshift stakes hidden in the underbrush. They had eaten cold rations and urinated into empty shell casings to avoid leaving the vehicle. They had waited in silence, cramped and freezing, because that was the job. When Kohler's half-track appeared on the road, Kemp felt a cold satisfaction. The trap was working. The enemy was cautious, but not cautious enough. He watched through his binoculars as the Germans dismounted, inspected the Sherman, and began the towing operation. He waited until the cable was taut, until the half-track's engine was roaring, until the crew was focused entirely on the task. Then he gave the order. The M10's 3-inch gun fired with a sound like the world splitting open. The shell crossed the 200 meters in less than a second, a streak of metal and physics moving faster than thought. It struck the SD-KFC 9 half-track on the left side, just behind the driver's compartment, and detonated. The explosion was not cinematic. There was no dramatic fireball, no slow-motion tumble of debris. The shell punched through the thin armor plating, fragmented inside the crew compartment, and turned human bodies into red mist and bone fragments. The half-track lurched sideways, its front wheels collapsing. The engine coughed once and died. Smoke, black and acrid, boiled from the ruptured hull. Feldwebel Kohler, who had been standing beside the vehicle, was thrown backward by the concussion. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from his lungs. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out all other sound. He tried to move, to understand what had happened, but his body refused to obey. Blood ran from his nose. His vision blurred. Gefreiter Lessing was dead. The shell had killed him instantly, along with Obergefreiter Brandt. There were no last words, no heroic gestures. One moment they were alive, focused on the mundane task of mechanical recovery. The next they were gone. Kohler's mind, shocked and struggling to process, latched onto a single thought: ambush. The Sherman had been bait. The open hatch. The intact tracks. The full ammunition racks. All of it designed to lure them in. And he had fallen for it. He rolled onto his stomach, clawing at the frozen ground, trying to crawl toward cover. His rifle was gone, lost in the blast. His left arm felt numb, useless. He could see the tree line now, 200 meters away, and the faint silhouette of the enemy vehicle. An M10. He recognized the shape from intelligence briefings, from photographs passed around in dim candlelight. A tank destroyer. Fast, deadly, and still aiming. Sergeant Kemp's crew was already reloading. The gun breech opened with a metallic clang. The spent shell casing tumbled out, smoking, and clattered onto the turret floor. The loader, a 19-year-old named Daniels, shoved a new round into the breech, slammed it closed, and shouted, "Up!" Kemp traversed the turret slightly, tracking Kohler's crawling form through his gun sight. The German was wounded, no longer a threat. But orders were orders. Prisoners were a luxury, and this was still contested ground. The enemy could have reinforcements nearby. Radio intercepts suggested German armor was still operating in the area, stragglers from the Bulge trying to regroup. Fire, Kemp said. The second shot missed Kohler by 3 meters, striking the frozen mud and detonating on impact. The explosion showered him with dirt and ice. He screamed, a sound he didn't recognize, and forced himself to his feet. He ran. His legs were unsteady, his lungs burning. Every breath tasted like blood and smoke. He ran toward the nearest hedgerow, a tangle of bare branches and frozen vines 50 meters away. The M10's machine gunner, a corporal named Jennings, opened fire with the .50 caliber Browning mounted on the turret. The heavy machine gun barked in short, controlled bursts, stitching the ground around Kohler's fleeing form. Mud and snow erupted in geysers. Tracer rounds, glowing orange in the gray morning light, lanced past him. One round caught him in the right thigh. He felt the impact before the pain, a hammer blow that shattered bone and sent him sprawling. He hit the ground face first, his mouth filling with mud. The pain came a second later, white-hot and unbearable. He tried to scream again, but his throat was clogged with dirt. He coughed, gagged, and rolled onto his back, staring up at the empty sky. The machine gun fire stopped. Silence returned, broken only by the crackle of flames from the burning half-track and the low rumble of the M10's engine. Kohler lay in the mud, bleeding, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He could feel his heartbeat slowing. He could feel the cold creeping into his limbs. He thought of his wife, Anna, and their 2 daughters in Hamburg. He wondered if they were still alive, if the city had been bombed again, if they would ever know what happened to him. He closed his eyes. Sergeant Kemp watched through his binoculars as the German stopped moving. The body lay still, a dark shape against the pale snow. He felt nothing. No satisfaction, no regret. Just the cold, clinical awareness that the mission was accomplished. The enemy recovery vehicle was destroyed. The crew was neutralized. The bait tank had worked exactly as intended. "Cease fire," he said quietly. The M10's engine rumbled as the driver, a soft-spoken man named Kowalski, put the vehicle in gear. They couldn't stay. Doctrine dictated that ambush units withdraw immediately after contact, before the enemy could respond with artillery or air support. The element of surprise was gone. The area was compromised. But before they left, Kemp had one more task. "Daniels, Jennings, dismount. Check the half-track in the German. Make sure there's nothing we can use." 5 minutes. The 2 men climbed out of the M10, rifles at the ready, and moved cautiously across the open ground. The half-track was a total loss, its interior gutted by fire and fragmentation. Lessing and Brandt were unrecognizable, their remains fused to the twisted metal. Daniels gagged and turned away. Jennings, older and harder, simply shook his head and moved on. They found Kohler 30 meters from the hedgerow, still breathing but barely conscious. His eyes were half open, unfocused. His lips moved, forming words no one could hear. Jennings knelt beside him, checking for weapons. He found none. He glanced back at the M10 where Kemp was watching through the commander's hatch. "Still alive, Sarge," Jennings called. Kemp hesitated. Prisoners were valuable for intelligence. But transporting a wounded enemy soldier was risky. The German needed immediate medical attention, attention they couldn't provide. Leaving him here meant he would die slowly from blood loss or exposure. Finishing the job would be a mercy. But Kemp was tired. Tired of decisions. Tired of killing. Tired of the weight of small, brutal choices that no one would ever know about except the men who lived them. "Leave him," Kemp said. "We're moving." Daniels and Jennings returned to the M10. The vehicle reversed, turned, and rumbled back into the tree line, disappearing within seconds. The sound of its engine faded. The field returned to silence. Kohler lay in the mud, staring at the sky. The pain was distant now, a dull throb that no longer seemed connected to his body. He thought he heard voices, German voices, calling his name. But when he tried to turn his head, there was nothing. Just the wind and the cold and the slow, inevitable darkness. He died sometime in the early afternoon. His body was found 3 days later by a Wehrmacht patrol conducting a sweep of the area. They buried him in a shallow grave beside the road, marked with a crude wooden cross. His name was misspelled. The date was wrong. But it didn't matter. By then the war had moved on. The Sherman remained in the ditch for another week, until an American recovery team finally arrived to tow it back to a field depot. The tank was repaired, refueled, and returned to service. It would fight in the Rhineland campaign, survive the war, and eventually be scrapped in a Belgian salvage yard in 1947. No one remembered it had once been bait. No one remembered the 3 Germans who died trying to claim it. War is full of such stories. Small, forgotten, and repeated endlessly in 1,000 variations across 1,000 battlefields. The details change. The names change. But the pattern remains the same. Desperation meets deception and someone dies. The ambush near Bastogne was not unique. Similar incidents occurred across the Western Front throughout the winter of 1945. American units, exploiting their material superiority and the chaos of German retreat, routinely used disabled vehicles as bait to lure enemy recovery crews, salvage parties, and opportunistic infantry. The tactic was informal, decentralized, and often improvised by junior officers and NCOs without higher approval. Field reports from the period are fragmentary, but several documented cases provide insight into the scale and effectiveness of these operations. On January 18, 1945, near Houffalize, Belgium, a disabled M4A1 Sherman was left in a roadside position after throwing a track. An M36 Jackson tank destroyer, concealed in a nearby barn, ambushed a German Stu G3 assault gun and a recovery half-track that attempted to tow the Sherman. Both German vehicles were destroyed. 4 Germans were killed, 2 captured. The American casualties, 0. On February 3, 1945, near Prüm, Germany, a similar ambush destroyed a Bergpanzer III recovery vehicle and killed its entire 5-man crew. The disabled bait vehicle in that case was a Sherman with a blown engine, abandoned deliberately after engineers determined it couldn't be quickly repaired. The ambush was conducted by infantry equipped with bazookas, not armor. The Germans never saw them coming. These incidents, multiplied across dozens of engagements, had a cumulative strategic effect. German logistics, already strained to the breaking point, became even more paralyzed. Recovery units, essential for maintaining the dwindling armored force, were decimated. Crews became reluctant to approach abandoned vehicles, even those that appeared legitimate. Salvage operations slowed. Valuable equipment was left to rust because no one dared retrieve it. The psychological toll was equally significant. German soldiers, from frontline infantry to rear echelon mechanics, began to view the battlefield as fundamentally untrustworthy. Every piece of terrain could hide an enemy. Every opportunity could be a trap. This erosion of confidence, subtle but pervasive, contributed to the general collapse of German fighting effectiveness in the final months of the war. For the Americans, the tactic was a low-cost, high-reward strategy. A single disabled tank, worth perhaps $44,000, could destroy enemy vehicles worth 10 times that amount, along with irreplaceable trained personnel. The moral and legal implications were rarely discussed. The Germans had pioneered ambush and deception tactics in Russia and North Africa. Turnabout, in the minds of Allied commanders, was fair play. But for the men who executed these ambushes, the experience was often more complex. Sergeant Roy Kemp returned to his unit after the engagement near Bastogne and filed a brief after-action report. He noted the destruction of 1 SD, KFC, 9 half-track and 3 enemy Kia. He made no mention of the wounded German left to die in the field. That detail was omitted not out of shame but because it was routine. The war was full of such omissions. Kemp survived the war. He returned to Iowa in 1946, married his high school sweetheart, and took over his father's farm. He never spoke about the ambush. He never spoke about most of his experiences in Europe. When asked by his children years later what the war had been like, he said only that it had been necessary. That was the word he used, necessary. Not glorious, not heroic, not tragic. Just necessary. The use of bait vehicles and hidden escorts became a minor but acknowledged element of American armored doctrine in the post-war analysis of the European campaign. Field manuals from the late 1940s and early 1950s, written by officers who had served in WWII, included sections on deception in mobile operations and exploitation of enemy salvage attempts. The tactic was never formalized into official doctrine, but it was studied, refined, and quietly incorporated into training scenarios. Soviet military theorists, observing American tactics through intelligence reports and captured documents, adopted similar methods during the late Stalin era. Soviet armored units in Eastern Europe conducted exercises involving bait tanks and ambush positions. The concept reappeared during the Korean War, where both UN and communist forces used disabled vehicles to lure enemy patrols into kill zones. For Germany, the lessons were learned too late to matter. By early 1945, the Wehrmacht was in irreversible decline. Fuel shortages, manpower losses, and the collapse of industrial production made recovery operations increasingly irrelevant. Tanks that could be repaired often couldn't be fueled. Crews that survived ambushes had nowhere to retreat. The war was ending and everyone knew it. The specific fate of Feldwebel Ernst Kohler was never officially recorded. His death was not reported in German casualty lists, which by that stage of the war were hopelessly incomplete. His family received no notification. His grave, marked with a misspelled name and wrong date, was eventually lost when the area was redeveloped in the 1960s. His daughters grew up believing their father had died somewhere in the East in Russia like so many others. They never learned the truth. The Sherman M4A3 that served as bait was repaired and returned to service within 2 weeks. It fought in the crossing of the Rhine, participated in the encirclement of the Ruhr Pocket, and was present when American forces linked up with Soviet troops at Torgau in April 1945. Its crew rotated several times. None of them knew the tank's history. It was just another Sherman, one of thousands, indistinguishable from any other. After the war, the tank was shipped to a collection point in Belgium, inspected and declared surplus. It was sold for scrap in 1947. The metal was melted down and repurposed, possibly into construction steel for the rebuilding of Europe. The physical object ceased to exist, but its story, fragmented, incomplete and largely forgotten, survived in scattered after-action reports, personal diaries, and the fading memories of old men who rarely spoke of what they had seen. The incident itself, one ambush among thousands, had no measurable impact on the outcome of the war. The strategic situation in early 1945 was already decided. Germany was defeated, its armies collapsing, its cities burning. Whether 3 German recovery crewmen lived or died changed nothing at the macro level. But at the micro level, the level of individual lives, of wives and daughters waiting in Hamburg, of farm boys from Iowa who carried invisible scars for decades, it changed everything. This is the paradox of war. Events that are historically insignificant can be personally devastating. The destruction of one half-track, the deaths of 3 men, the survival of a 4th, the choices made by a young sergeant in a frozen field, none of it mattered to history. All of it mattered to the people involved. War is often remembered through its grand narratives. The invasions, the battles, the turning points that shifted the fate of nations. D-Day. The Battle of the Bulge. The Fall of Berlin. These are the stories that fill textbooks and documentaries, the moments when history pivots on decisions made by generals and statesmen. But war is also made of smaller moments. A recovery crew spotting a tank in a ditch. A sergeant deciding whether to show mercy. A wife in Hamburg waiting for a letter that will never come. These moments don't appear in the grand narratives. They don't change the outcome of campaigns or the trajectory of history. But they are the texture of war, the lived experience of the millions who fought, suffered, and died in service of causes they often didn't fully understand. The ambush near Bastogne, if it can even be called that, so brief and one-sided was the violence, is a microcosm of this larger truth. It was a trap. It was effective. It was brutal. And it was utterly routine, repeated in countless variations across the battlefields of Europe. The men involved were not heroes or villains. They were simply soldiers doing what soldiers do. Trying to survive, trying to complete their missions, trying to reconcile the impossible demands of duty and conscience. The Sherman that served as bait was a machine, built to be used and discarded. The half-track that tried to tow it was another machine, equally expendable. But the men inside those machines were irreplaceable. Their deaths, like all deaths in war, created absences that could never be filled. Families were broken. Futures were erased. And the world moved on, indifferent. This is what war leaves behind. Not just the destroyed vehicles and the scarred landscapes, but the invisible wounds, the unanswered questions, the stories that are forgotten because no one survives to tell them. The Sherman in the ditch was recovered and repaired. The men who died trying to claim it were buried in unmarked graves. And the war, vast and impersonal, rolled on toward its inevitable conclusion. In the end, the hidden Escort was not just a tank destroyer in a tree line. It was the machinery of war itself, cold, efficient, and merciless. It waited in the shadows of every decision, every opportunity, every moment of hope or greed or desperation. And when the moment came, it struck without hesitation, without regret, without memory. That is the lesson if there is one. In war, nothing is as it seems. Trust is a luxury no one can afford. And the price of survival is paid not in courage or skill, but in the willingness to see every human being, friend or enemy, as a potential threat. The Sherman in the ditch was bait. The Germans who tried to tow it were prey. And the men who killed them were hunters, doing a job that would haunt them quietly for the rest of their lives.